Hello everybody, is I 8-Bit Games here, and today we are going to be recording more of the Minecraft mod. Today we're going to be going over the tricks Ignite, Blaze, and Smite. And we're also going to be going a key note that you should take when dealing with vector coordinate positions in Minecraft. Ignite is a size spell that sets a target entity on fire. You give it a entity such as the caster or something that's attacked you or something that you attack, and it'll set that creature on fire for a certain set amount of time. Blaze is kind of similar, but instead it creates fire on a given point. Now, a key thing to note here is Blaze can only do it on a full block and not on a half block. So keep that in mind. Then we have Smite, which takes a coordinate position and then causes lightning to fall down on that. So yeah, we're going to show that real quick. We're going to take Trick Ignite. We're going to take out our spell bullet and instead replace it with a projectile spell bullet, since we are dealing with coordinates here. In order to do Ignite, we need to insert an entity, so we're going to do Focus Entity, which will get the entity that the target is looking at, and the target in this case is going to be us. So we're going to use Ignite to get us, or the target entity we are looking at. And I'm going to put it for spell time 5. And I'm sorry, in this case we won't be using the projectile spell bullet, and we can just use a regular spell bullet. Alright, now we have our Ignite spell. We're going to, when we cast this, it'll take us, the caster, get the entity we're looking at, and then set them on fire for 5 seconds. You will get a spell error if you aren't looking at an entity. But besides that, it should fairly work. Next, we are going to have Blaze. Blaze requires a position vector. If we put in entity position and then focal point, this should allow us to simply use a projectile spell in order to cast Blaze. Sorry, wrong one. In order to cast Blaze. What this is going to do is it will, when we cast a spell, projectile bolt, the place that the bullet lands is called the focal point. That's an entity. By getting the position of that entity, we can then make it so that whatever space the bullet lands, Blaze will activate. And then boom. We don't have to use focal point. We can hand put in a vector position if we use something like vector construct to create XYZ coordinates for a spell. Smite. Now, I want to show you something. Smite works the same way as Blaze. We simply take an entity's position, which can also be the focal point of our spell bullet, and it will cause lightning to strike there. Some key things I would like to note about XYZ position coordinates in Minecraft is it might not be what you think. Here we have 2 XYZ coordinates. Well, 2 XYZ coordinate grids. You notice the difference between these two? The X and the Z axes have been swapped. Now, between the two, can you guess which one Minecraft's grid system is based off of? The first one. Normally, you would think when making a graph, you just increase a new dimension. Like this would be an X graph. If we wanted to do a 2-dimensional one, we add a Y dimension and then go out with Z. However, there is no universally constant method of composing a 3-dimensional graph. And truth be told, there are 6 total ways you could structure a 3-dimensional graph. Now, you might not think there's a big difference between these 2 grid systems. However, there is. For example, assuming this white block is the origin for both, if I wanted to say cast lightning at 4x and 2z, it would be right here. So going to mark that for distance. However, on this graph, it will appear quite different. Boom, right there. Now the difference is a bit minor. However, when we wish to be completely efficient with a spell, accuracy is a very important thing to note. So keep in mind that Minecraft's XYZ grid isn't the same as something you'd see in Desmos calculator. Hell, Desmos calculator is extremely different from what I'd typically use to make an XYZ grid. Second thing I wish to note here is that lightning has this amount of range, meaning an entity right here would get hit by lightning struck right here. Watch. If we create a small box that houses a Vindicator, and then we cast Smite here, the Vindicator will light on fire from the lightning. However, any further from this distance, it will not set on fire. So do keep that in mind. Now that we have an understanding of Smite, Blaze, and Ignite, we'll be looking at 2 spells that use those tricks specifically. The first one we have is Hash's Scorcher. This spell works by casting 3 trick smites in the direction you're looking. It does this by taking the position of the caster, which is you, and then taking the look vector of the caster and multiplying it by 4. And then adding those 2 gets the position of Smite. A key note about vector multiply is that it multiplies the XYZ value that you're looking at the most. A normal look vector would have values no bigger than 1. However, with multiply, since I'm looking in the x-axis, as you can see here, it multiplies the x value by 4. Works backwards as well. If I was looking in the z direction, it will instead multiply the z value backwards and forwards. It also does the same for the y value. So, by taking the direction you're looking at and multiplying it by 4, it will then add this to your position value and move it from my position to 4 blocks in the direction I'm looking. It also does this for 7 blocks and 10 blocks. Here's an example of Hash's Scorcher. As you can see, it did 1, 4, 7, and 10 blocks away from me. It is direction specific, thanks to the use of vector multiply. That was Hash's Scorcher by eatYourHashs. I'll give a link to the spell description in the description of the video. The next spell we'll be looking at is Inferno Crispy Crunchy Burning Fun by deFazerZ. Inferno is a loop cast spell that selects a group of targets and randomly switches between targets, igniting them on fire as it does so. It does this with a Trick Ignite spell, which takes a random entity from all entities that are glowing, which is every entity that is on fire, and all entities it gets from a selection of all nearby living entities in a radius equal to the amount of times the spell is casted, unless it's bigger than 6, in which it will cast it with a radius of 6. It does this selection in a saved vector position, which it gets a saved vector position by taking a selection of all living entities closest to the point that the save vector is cast, which is the previous entity its selected position, or if no entity was selected, for instance the first time the spell is cast, an arrow catcher will replace the closest to point selection. It does a second closest to point selection in replacement of the first if there is no saved vector, which does a selection of all nearby entities within a radius of 6 blocks at whatever block this ray cast hits first in the direction the player is looking at. If you don't know what a ray cast is, essentially it takes a position and a direction and makes an invisible line from there going until it hits something. So whatever block this vector ray cast hits, it will do a radius of 6 around and get all nearby entities, and it will take the closest entity to the point the ray cast hit, gets its position, and saves it into a vector, which it will then do a selection of all nearby living entities at that saved vector and set one of them on fire. And whatever entity it set on fire, it will then get the entity's position and do a second selection of all nearby entities and choose another random entity from that position. And I'll continuously doing this until all entities are dead or the spell stops casting. For a visual example, here we have is a selection of entities. If I were to cast this spell, it would take my position and the direction I'm looking in and do a ray cast until it hits a block and gets the position of that block. And that will be the position where a radius 6 nearby living entities selection is done. And the closest entity of these to the point that I was originally looking at will be selected. And then from that point, that entity's position, a second selection will be done. That will then select one of those entities randomly and set them on fire. Now, when you first cast the spell, the second entity selection has a radius equal to the amount of times the spell has been casted, or 6 if it's casted more than 6 times. This guarantees that the second selection is small at first, so it will hit whatever entity it's being casted from first. So if I look at this guy, he will be the first position that the spell gets from an entity, him, and because the second selection doesn't have that big of a radius, he will be the first person to burn. But then it will randomly switch targets to igniting someone else, and it'll go back and forth until they're all dead. Okay, well, it didn't happen that time, but it usually happens like that. But as you can see, it randomly is switching targets and setting them on fire. Each person who is set on fire will then have the selection done in a radius around from their position, and it'll switch to another random entity in that selection radius. And then it'll keep going and doing that as it switches back and forth until they're all dead, which will probably take a while. As you can see, they're all dead, and the spell works. That was this side video for today. If you want to see where I got those spells from, I should have Reddit links in the description of the video, which will take you to the forum post where the spells came from. I've been 8-Bit Games. If you enjoyed this, make sure to like, comment, subscribe. I'll be with you always. And have a great day, everyone. Goodbye.